Chapter 64. To Walk in Dreams. Ember. Breakfast is ready. Sighing, Ember burrowed deeper under the blankets and closed his eyes, smiling into the flattened pillow. Birds chirped down by the river, but he'd been up too late catching crickets and fireflies the night before. There would be time to check the nets later. Ember. A pot clinked by the fire, its crackling warmth taking the chill off a late spring morning. Footsteps shuffled across the floorboards, and a gentle hand pulled the blankets away from his face. "Your sister is already on her way to town. Hurry and eat, and you can catch her halfway." "MMMHH," he groaned. "Too tired." "Wake up, Ember." A faint twinge of discomfort made him grimace into the pillow, and he shut his eyes all the more tightly. He didn't want to get up just yet, but an uneasy feeling gnawed at the pit of his stomach. Perhaps if he ate some breakfast, it would take the edge off his hunger. "Hunter's in town today," his mother coaxed, her voice as golden as her hair. He could see her in his mind's eye, though not so clearly as usual. The details of her face eluded him. How quickly he'd forgotten. How strange. But he knew, somehow, that if he opened his eyes, it would fade away forever. The world felt strangely hollow, and the sunlight that streamed through the open doorway darkened and cooled, its welcome warmth disappearing as a cloud passed over the sky. A chill seeped through the blankets, and he flinched as that gnawing ache returned. He pressed a hand over his stomach and rolled onto his back, the blankets twisting around him. If he could only tell his mother, she would know what to do. She would make everything right again. But his eyes would not open and his mouth remained shut, the words eluding him. "Ember, child," she whispered, cool fingers touching his forehead. "Wake up. Come and eat." He groaned again. "Ember." The voice took on a frantic tone. "Awake." His eyes flew open and he gasped. There was nothing but darkness to greet him, and he reached out to where he thought the voice had been. Roots and vines dangled before him, and he felt the knotted weave of them beneath his fingers. A familiar bower. "Mother." He called softly. There was no reply. He stumbled wildly in the direction of the cabin door, or where it ought to have been, brushing roots and leaves from his face. They creaked around him, almost a living thing, and with a cry of effort he broke free of their grasp and pitched forward into open air. The familiar wooden step cracked beneath him, and a golden light flickered faintly in the distance. It reminded him of something. The darkness lifted for half a moment, and he could see his sister waiting for him down the path. The flicker must have been a wisp of her golden curls, which hung loose about her neck and lofted slightly in the morning breeze. She turned away from him. "Wait." A hand appeared from the looming dark, and took hers, and she was gone without so much as a farewell or a backward glance. "Come back, please," he shouted, suddenly frantic. "I didn't even get to say goodbye." He darted up the trail, into the dusky light where the leaves grew thick and the branches tangled together, choking him in darkness. The air grew suddenly thinner and colder, and suddenly he could see his own breath before his eyes. He held out a hand, picking his way carefully through the thickets, and a snowflake settled gently on his fingertips. That golden glimmer appeared again as the trees gave way before him, and he found himself standing before the blown sparks of a campfire. The outline of a man took shape before the dancing flames, and Ember realized that several shapeless people were crowded around him, partially obscuring his view. It was Hunter. A lute was in his hands, and he plucked the strings with surprising dexterity, a memory that Ember had almost entirely forgotten. He couldn't remember the last time Hunter had toted such an instrument about with him. But there was no more time to recollect, for Hunter had already begun to sing in his coarse, confident manner. "I bring you whispered tidings of a deathless ocean queen, the likes of which yon lowland folk have ne'er heard nor seen. Nary a ship would near her strand, no man could tame his fear, our captain only laughed and cried, be there no hearties here? An honest crew all sailor born what feared ne beast nor squall, we turned our prow into this gale to mark a siren's call. My captain to her devilry fell, he could not be revived. Of all who boarded the damned ship but one man survived. So hearken to my tale, O woe, hell's warn if I be lying. Her smile before my waking eyes, those sea winds ever sighing. The plucked strings trembled a moment longer, and as the music faded away, Ember realized that all the birds and crickets had gone quiet. Then a woman's timid voice quivered from the dark. "Do you mean to bring the river folk upon us with that ballad?" "Truth," grunted Alden. Ember glanced over his shoulder with a start, but could not see him either. "They say the folk are drawn to singing. Bad luck, playing a song like that in these parts." "Is it, now?" Hunter squared his shoulders, but an easy smile flickered over his features. "You're lucky weren't single quote no proper song. I'll wager my caterwauling frighted 'em off, if any were about." A few of the younger women laughed, but the men grumbled unhappily. "Overstayed his welcome, he has," muttered Lunder, a ghost in the shadows, and with that, the collection of voices began to disperse. Soon no one remained but Ember. Hunter rose to his feet, stringing the lute across his back, and met his gaze with dark, beady eyes. "Have a care on your wander home, boy," he grunted. "Frightening things to be found along the river path at this hour." Ember shivered, and listened as he plucked a few more strings on the lute, wistful notes echoing through the valley as the firelight played across his wooden instrument. "Are you going to see the ocean?" Ember couldn't help but ask. "Aye. Take me with you," he cried eagerly. "You promised you would, someday, and there's nothing left for me here." Tilting his head and squinting into the darkness, Hunter hummed a familiar tune, reaching into his pocket and pulling out something strange and luminous, like a little star. It reminded him of the stone light he had left behind. For a moment Ember thought he heard another, sweeter voice beneath his gruff tones. Something cold touched Ember's hand, and the scent of crushed petals overwhelmed him. "Cain single quote," said Hunter roughly, bowing his head and turning away. And then he was gone, and the haggard wayfarer and his old sea ballad were swept away in a river of mist. Ember stumbled after him, shivering, and wrapped his arms around his waist as the leaves rustled overhead. 64. To walk in dreams. Ember. Breakfast is ready. Sighing, Ember burrowed deeper under the blankets and closed his eyes, smiling into the flattened pillow. Birds chirped down by the river, but he'd been up too late catching crickets and fireflies the night before. There would be time to check the nets later. Ember. A pot clinked by the fire, its crackling warmth taking the chill off a late spring morning. Footsteps shuffled across the floorboards, and a gentle hand pulled the blankets away from his face. "Your sister is already on her way to town. Hurry and eat, and you can catch her halfway." "MMMHH," he groaned. "Too tired." "Wake up, Ember." A faint twinge of discomfort made him grimace into the pillow, and he shut his eyes all the more tightly. He didn't want to get up just yet, but an uneasy feeling gnawed at the pit of his stomach. Perhaps if he ate some breakfast, it would take the edge off his hunger. "Hunter's in town today," his mother coaxed, her voice as golden as her hair. He could see her in his mind's eye, though not so clearly as usual. The details of her face eluded him. How quickly he'd forgotten. How strange. But he knew, somehow, that if he opened his eyes, it would fade away forever. The world felt strangely hollow, and the sunlight that streamed through the open doorway darkened and cooled, its welcome warmth disappearing as a cloud passed over the sky. A chill seeped through the blankets, and he flinched as that gnawing ache returned. He pressed a hand over his stomach and rolled onto his back, the blankets twisting around him. If he could only tell his mother, she would know what to do. She would make everything right again. But his eyes would not open and his mouth remained shut, the words eluding him. "Ember, child," she whispered, cool fingers touching his forehead. "Wake up. Come and eat." He groaned again. "Ember." The voice took on a frantic tone. "Awake." His eyes flew open and he gasped. There was nothing but darkness to greet him, and he reached out to where he thought the voice had been. Roots and vines dangled before him, and he felt the knotted weave of them beneath his fingers. A familiar bower. "Mother," he called softly. There was no reply. He stumbled wildly in the direction of the cabin door, or where it ought to have been, brushing roots and leaves from his face. They creaked around him, almost a living thing, and with a cry of effort he broke free of their grasp and pitched forward into open air. The familiar wooden step cracked beneath him, and a golden light flickered faintly in the distance. It reminded him of something. The darkness lifted for half a moment, and he could see his sister waiting for him down the path. The flicker must have been a wisp of her golden curls, which hung loose about her neck and lofted slightly in the morning breeze. She turned away from him. Wait. A hand appeared from the looming dark, and took hers, and she was gone without so much as a farewell or a backward glance. "Come back, please," he shouted, suddenly frantic. "I didn't even get to say goodbye." He darted up the trail, into the dusky light where the leaves grew thick and the branches tangled together, choking him in darkness. The air grew suddenly thinner and colder, and suddenly he could see his own breath before his eyes. He held out a hand, picking his way carefully through the thickets, and a snowflake settled gently on his fingertips. That golden glimmer appeared again as the trees gave way before him, and he found himself standing before the blown sparks of a campfire. The outline of a man took shape before the dancing flames, and Ember realized that several shapeless people were crowded around him, partially obscuring his view. It was Hunter. A lute was in his hands, and he plucked the strings with surprising dexterity, a memory that Ember had almost entirely forgotten. He couldn't remember the last time Hunter had toted such an instrument about with him. But there was no more time to recollect, for Hunter had already begun to sing in his coarse, confident manner. "I bring you whispered tidings of a deathless ocean queen, the likes of which yon lowland folk have ne'er heard nor seen. Nary a ship would near her strand, no man could tame this fear, our captain only laughed and cried, be there no hearties here? An honest crew all sailor born what feared ne beast nor squall, we turned our prow into this gale to mark a siren's call. My captain to her devilry fell, he could not be revived. Of all who boarded the damned ship but one man survived. So hearken to my tale, O woe, hell's warn if I be lying. Her smile before my waking eyes, those sea winds ever sighing." The plucked strings trembled a moment longer, and as the music faded away, Ember realized that all the birds and crickets had gone quiet. Then a woman's timid voice quivered from the dark, "Do you mean to bring the river folk upon us with that ballad?" "Truth," grunted Alden. Ember glanced over his shoulder with a start, but could not see him either. "They say the folk are drawn to singing. Bad luck, playing a song like that in these parts." "Is it, now?" Hunter squared his shoulders, but an easy smile flickered over his features. "You're lucky T weren't single quote T no proper song. I'll wager my caterwauling affrighted 'em off, if any were about." A few of the younger women laughed, but the men grumbled unhappily. "Overstayed his welcome, he has," muttered Lunder, a ghost in the shadows, and with that, the collection of voices began to disperse. Soon no one remained but Ember. Hunter rose to his feet, stringing the lute across his back, and met his gaze with dark, beady eyes. "Have a care on your wander home, boy," he grunted. "Frightening things to be found along the river path at this hour." Ember shivered, and listened as he plucked a few more strings on the lute, wistful notes echoing through the valley as the firelight played across his wooden instrument. "Are you going to see the ocean?" Ember couldn't help but ask. "Aye. Take me with you," he cried eagerly. "You promised you would, someday, and there's nothing left for me here." Tilting his head and squinting into the darkness, Hunter hummed a familiar tune, reaching into his pocket and pulling out something strange and luminous, like a little star. It reminded him of the stone light he had left behind. For a moment Ember thought he heard another, sweeter voice beneath his gruff tones. Something cold touched Ember's hand, and the scent of crushed petals overwhelmed him. "Cane single quote T," said Hunter roughly, bowing his head and turning away. And then he was gone, and the haggard wayfarer and his old sea ballad were swept away in a river of mist. Ember stumbled after him, shivering, and wrapped his arms around his waist as the leaves rustled overhead. Chapter 65. Sunlight. Ember pulled the blanket up beneath his chin and rolled to one side, wondering why his mattress was packed hard like rooted earth, and why his cabin smelled like river crocuses and dried summer grasses. The river was so close, so loud, with only the birds and the occasional sound of flapping cloth to disturb it. Something rustled nearby and he squinted against the unwelcome daylight, He really must stop leaving his door open by mistake. A songbird flapped over his head with a chirring trill, so close the wind of it stirred his hair, and he sat up on his elbows with a start, blinking rapidly in the sudden brightness. A few yellow petals fluttered through his hair, flowers tumbling around him. He lay in a little clearing that he did not know, beside a burbling brook that was not his river, near a stone bridge which had half crumbled away 100 years before his name was first spoken. The blanket was not even his blanket, but a tattered woolen garment which had been draped across his sleeping form, and he felt the frayed edges of it between his fingers. A gray woolen dress. He winced at a faint ache beneath his ribs and tossed the covering aside, abashed to find that he was naked except for the remainder of her skirt, the rest of which had been torn to strips and wrapped securely about his bare waist. Flowering herbs and crushed leaves crumbled away from the tattered cloth like moss on a stone, some sort of poultice. Only then did he notice, waking fully from his dream, that his right hand was wrapped in like fashion, and as his blurry vision focused across the clearing, the source of the fabric snapping and rustling presented itself as his tunic and trousers, and several more strips of stained cloth which had been rinsed and set to dry. They hung from a gnarled oak limb like the trees in the town square on washing day, lofting in the breeze. Faint humming drifted up the forested hillside, weaving through the roots and grasses, a breathy working tune which ebbed and flowed the way he imagined the ocean tides to ebb and flow. It was unlike any song the village women had sung in the valley below Sister's Mountain, but he knew the swaying lilt of it. A soft footstep alighted on the mossy ground in half-covered flagstones. Graceful fingers curled around the tunic, brushing it aside. A feminine figure stepped forth, strands of black hair looping across her shoulders, and she was both intimate and strange to him. Her body was damp and shimmered like abalone shells, clad in nothing but her hair, arms laden with wild onions, meadows wheat, rose hips, and the last of the summer chickweed. When their eyes met, she paused with her lips parted, and then moved toward him with quick, soft steps. Bare feet patted on packed soil and buried flagstones, rustling through dried grasses. Before he could bestir himself, she dropped to her knees beside him, the bundle of leaves tumbling from her arms. Her fragrant tresses brushed his ribs, and his eyes left her face, wandering down the length of her body. She smiled and preened her hair over a patch where there was none, self-consciously, he thought, but half a moment later those fingers flitted to his face, her touch soft and cool and comforting, like spring rain. He pressed his palm over the back of her hand, the cloth bandage muffling his grasp. Without thinking, he lifted his other hand to sweep the tattered hair from her face, tucking it behind one ear. His mouth turned up in a helpless grin. He must have looked a fool, though he could not bring himself to care. It was right to have her near. To have her near. And nearer. She tipped her head to one side, the dark eyes he had once thought empty swirling with a tangle of emotions that were now all too easily discerned, desire foremost among them. Desire. Her breath touched his lips as she bent down, more of her long dark hair falling in wild curtains around them. Hesitant. Ember slipped his hand behind her neck. The scent of the crushed morning earth rose up to greet them both as the woman from the river met the fisherman's son with an open-mouthed kiss. He felt nothing and everything of that moment, the softness of her lips, dripping in florals and honey delight, the prick of a feral tooth against his tongue, the way she gently tugged his lower lip between her teeth. Trailed her careful caresses along the edge of his bristly jaw. "Ember, Ember, my Ember," she whispered sweetly, brushing his ear with her nose. "Are you my Ember?" "Kentucky," he gasped, scarcely able to breathe. "Are you mine, Kentucky?" And with those words he found at last he had come to the end of the road, the winding, war-torn, spell-ravaged road which had taken him so far from his lazy river and quiet woodlands, from everything familiar that he had once known and loved. Here, on the other side of it all, he discovered that home was not a cabin in the forest, but another hand in his. His Kentucky had fashioned a nest for them both amidst the creeping wildness, the remnants of a time which had once been. The trees as good as four walls and a door, the forest their picket fence garden hemmed in by bush and bole, each branch a clothless line, the babbling brook their wellspring, the half-buried flagstones a cabin floor. "Wherever you go, beautiful Ember," she sighed, tangling her fingers into his hair. "I will surely be following you, until death should part us." Tears streamed from both his eyes. He pressed his hands against her waist, pulling her closer, inviting her touch. "Until death," he agreed. And she quietly claimed him for her own, in the rustling stillness of a summer wood. In return, she gave to him herself, and that with a willing shyness. She shaped her form to his with all eagerness, half desperation, but he soon kissed such worries away. Ember only cared for Kentucky as she had ever been, as he loved her, simply. His relentless affection was sufficient, desire all-consuming. Never before had he bared so much of himself to anyone, been so undone, tasted such ecstasy. Her gratefulness, her relief, her furious adoration poured over him like water. He found his fingers clumsy where hers were deft, and her usual confidence faltering where his brimmed full, and yet in the inelegance of uncertainty, neither felt the need to speak with words where glance or touch was sufficient. At last, so very quietly, his soul sought hers in the silence. Her innermost secret welcomed him, threads unraveling, intertwining, weaving together, an explosion of color, a blinding brilliance, and for a moment, they became as they had always been, were always, and would always be. For a single, spectacular moment, he knew the river woman as fully as he knew himself. When the colors faded, bright and fleeting, they had taken with them a golden, ephemeral thread. He felt it unravel from the infinite tapestry of his soul, and, in the rushing peacefulness which settled after, observed that something new and strange lingered in its place. Something dark, like the first spring rushes in the twilight hours, cold like the touch of the winter frost, gentle as the first breath of autumn. It tapped a rhythm beneath his breast, that fragment of a siren's heart. Not until each had wandered one another to their own satisfaction did they lay together for an eternal moment, breathless and glistening. Her fingers combed carelessly through his damp curls as she lay sighing in his arms. Ember caressed her sticky face with his thumb, felt the curve of her smile. Everything they had suffered until now was only a passing thing, twisted by dreams and chased away like mist before the rising sun. He brushed her cheek again. Relief swept over him with the breeze. She rested her head upon the hollow of his sternum and her hands upon his shoulders, and it felt to Ember as if she had been shaped from the moon, the mist, and the sea to nestle there for the rest of forever. Perhaps, indeed, she had. Ember leaned against the bole of the tree, patches of sunlight swaying across the backs of his eyelids as Kentucky rinsed her dress in the stream beyond his sight, humming to herself. It felt as if it had always been so, and yet each time she swept a damp curl from his forehead, or brushed against his skin while she wove her healing songs and freshened his bandages, or bent low to kiss him full on the mouth, the line of his jaw, the side of his neck, it always felt in some way as if it were the first time they had touched. At last, he slowly made his way to the bridge to rinse his face and hair. Moving too quickly sent little shivers of pain through his stomach, but the first sip of crisp, clear mountain water was reward enough for his efforts. He scooped up palmfuls, drinking deep until his dry throat was sated and his parched tongue soothed. Then he splashed his face, shook the droplets from his fingers, and sat on his knees in the mud, wiping his hands on his soiled tunic and turning his face toward the sun. He sat in silence for several minutes more, listening to the wind in the trees until the splashing ceased and a faint rustle stirred in the grass near his feet. There was a gentle patter of falling water. When he opened his eyes, Kentucky stood beside him wringing droplets from her hair, the remnants of the damp woolen dress hanging limply from her form. Even seeing her clothed now sent a wash of welcome heat rising up through his neck to the tips of his ears. As his eyes adjusted to the sun and shade, an eager smile bloomed upon her face. "You seem better." "I feel better," he agreed, squinting up at her. "Are you hungry? I left a few rose hips for you." She tugged the torn sleeve higher and picked at loose threads with a shrug. "Have the rest. I find I hunger less than before." Before he could marvel too long at her statement, she continued, "Do you think, perhaps, there are any of your folk dwelling nearby?" "I've never been to this side of the mountains," Ember admitted, slowly getting to his feet. Kentucky offered him a hand, and he stood still for a few minutes, huffing slightly from the effort. "Besides, if anyone sees you, Or me, in this state, they'll run away in fright." He gestured to his own makeshift bandages and threadbare tunic. Kentucky sniffed. "It seems there is only one good thing to be doing." He blinked, surprised. "And what is that?" "Find a human nest and take their clothes." Ember's mouth popped open. "You jest." "I do not." Kentucky examined her claws, running her thumb over her pointer finger and chewing the end of it. "We are in desperate need of something fitting, and I must be hiding myself from strangers on the road. Food, clothing, whatever we desire can surely be borrowed. Sirens simply take what they need." "Well, I'm not a siren, and we'll not make thieves of ourselves," he said firmly, frowning at Kentucky for the first time since she had appeared before him clad in nothing but her hair. She finally looked up at him, and he glimpsed once more the impudent sprite who had craftily lured him up the mountain trail. "If we are telling them a few true things, they might be giving us what we need in exchange for our swiftly leaving again." Ember relented, taken in by her confidence. "Or they'll be throwing rocks at us. If that, then it is as I am saying before, we borrow in secret, and bring them nice things later. I will gladly do this thing for you, and you need never know where I got them from, if it bothers you so much. Perhaps one thing from each nest we find, to be kind." He scoffed gently, but couldn't help returning her soft smile. She grabbed his hand, tugging him upright. He obliged with a grunt, grasping the makeshift bandage. It had held together well, all things considered, and the knitband would need but a few days to work the most of its simple magic. Magic! Ember could almost hear those rushing voices again, and he sighed as they slipped through his fingers once more. It was senseless to wish for that crashing knowledge to sweep over him again. Senseless, and annoying in its constant evasions, for he had the distinct impression that if he could only grasp it and hold onto it for half a moment, he could understand and access it again. Perhaps even work a bit of magic myself. Lunder's grandmother would sneer at him for his nonsense. Isabel would have tossed her hair in a silent dismissal. Alden surely would have told him to put his head to things that mattered. Hunter would merely laugh and regale him with tales of ill-fated spellweavers from long ago. Indeed, his own mother would have cursed him out for daring to speak the word magic. But Ember had encountered so many ancient weavings, known so much hardship, and endured so many nights alone in a mountain full of fraying enchantments that he was a different man, here on the other side. And he was no longer afraid to ponder such wonders as lay beyond his comprehension. For they did not seem so far out of reach as they once had. "Perhaps I can earn a bit of coin in town, whatever town that might be. I suppose Ridgeful is the nearest from here. If only I had a map." He stuffed a hand in the pocket of his trousers, sighing wistfully. "Wish I'd thought to grab some of that gold from Sister's Mountain when—" "No." Kentucky's voice was firm and melodic. "It is for the better. Let the sisters be keeping what is theirs." He squinted up at the two-headed mountain, blinking rapidly in the sunlight, and then turned back to Kentucky. She stood before him in her tattered dress, chin uplifted, thorns and burrs clinging to the torn hem in her clean, messy hair hanging loose around her shoulders, a queen in peasant's raiment. Then she rose up on the toes of her bare feet, so that she did not have to look up at him so steeply, and returned his open-mouthed smile. "I think I know the meaning of your word, contentment, now." "Do you indeed?" Ember replied, drinking in the sight of her with his roving eyes. "We ought to leave just as soon as I am well enough to walk short distances. The weather would be starting to turn, and I want to be out of these hills when the frosts come." Her fangs glimmered in the flashing sunlight. "Where are we off to?" A thrill swept through him, borne on the late summer breeze that whispered through the trees, carrying with it a hint of autumn and the promise of color and cozy nights. Together, they could keep warm in a bed of rustling leaves, and he would kindle them aflame when the harsher winds came down from the north. "But first, there's something I need," he confessed, a pained grimace already tugging at his smile. "Anything," Kentucky sniffed, gathering up one of his hands and pressing it to her cheek. Her breath cooled his wrist. "Tell me, sweet Ember, and it shall be yours. I need to go back to the lake." Her smile flickered and dimmed, and she blinked rapidly. "Why?" "Because I need to," he said, a bit louder. and she tightened her grip on his hand. "I don't know why, exactly. I'm sorry. I've been trying to make sense of everything that happened, in my head. Things I felt. Things I heard, that I don't understand. You don't have to come with me. You can wait for me here, by the bridge." "No," she growled, and cast him a look he didn't quite know how to interpret. "I will not be letting you out of my sight ever again." His heart beat faster. A short while ago, those words would have compelled him to run. Now there was only a warmth and whispering desire to bring her close and kiss the mouth that spoke them. "Ever again?" he pressed, amused. "MMMH." Kentucky relented, the look softening slightly. "Not for many days, no. If you go today, I follow." Ember nodded gratefully. "We go together, then." Chapter 66. Sentiment. In the light of a hazy summer afternoon, Crescent Lake appeared strangely black. The sun reflected off a dancing surface which might have been lost to him forever. Somewhere out there, a body was floating, but it was not his, and for that he thanked the Maker. He wiggled his bare toes, sinking deeper into the cool dark mud of the shore, almost within reach of the lapping wavelets but not quite. He could never bring himself to enter those waters again, and indeed found he had acquired a distinct disliking for ponds and lakes. He wondered if that made him a coward. Ember contemplated this. Half-spoken whispers and fragments of a starry sky misted his vision. Confessions scented with spring crocuses, and the heady fragrance of a strong summer wine, weighted down by the iron warning of blood upon his tongue. Encroaching death, elation and despair, tangled together as one. Surely, if he had to do it over again, he could do it again, he would do it again. But he would not enjoy doing it, and he thought that was all right. "You followed me," Kentucky mused softly beside him, "though I ran from you. I did not know why at first." Ember twined their fingers together. "I might be very young in your eyes, but together we are stronger. I'll keep you safe, Kentucky, whatever happens. I can promise you that." She hummed happily. "And so you do." "I had helped at night, you know," remarked Ember, even more quietly. "If Fishbutter hadn't shattered itself, you wouldn't be standing beside me now." The woman from the river glanced down, blinking rather hard. "Fishbutter." Ember reddened, and then smiled ruefully, and then frowned, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yes. That was its name. His name, I suppose." "Yes, I know. I heard that name in your dream," she admitted distantly. "Oh. Right. I only kept it from you because, well, I suppose it's obvious now, isn't it?" She absently untwined their fingers, letting her hand fall to her side. Ember noticed the chill of her absence, but graciously pretended he did not. "A fit name." "Those spells did not like me," Kentucky said stiffly, tipping her head as a late summer breeze glided across her face, ruffling her hair and stirring up the scent of crushed flowers. Ember took a deeper breath, eyes half shut. "But some fish ought to be bitten. We came to an agreement because of my mistake. The metal, and now I am sorry for Fishbutter, though more sorry for your loss." "Not all weapons are lucky enough to choose their own end," Ember reminded her, thinking of his ill-fated fishing spear, lovingly hewn for a simple life and broken by blood and bone. "I'll never forget him, at the least. I've been marked by that blade forever." He punctuated the sentiment with a short laugh, touching a hand to the makeshift bandages. Kentucky cast him a quick, concerned glance. "I am certain that, in time, I will be singing your scars away. Maybe I want to keep them," he shrugged, ducking his head and squinting into the sparkling blackness of the waters. "Maybe I want something to remember all of this." An unsung woe he could not name pricked at the corners of his eyes as he thought of the mangled corpse beneath the mountain, of the pale woman in white whose essence was now scattered forever to the winds, of the ancient voices which had crowded his mind and then fled, leaving nothing but a glimmer of desire in their wake. Kentucky bent low to observe him, wreaths of hair falling across her shoulder, and when he did not respond she crouched in the mud, shuffling in front of his shoes and tugging insistently at his hands. "Metal and runes. They are not really being alive," she ventured kindly, but even she did not sound certain. though the lull of her words soothed his soul. Metal cannot die. But a weapon can die, Ember stated, a belief he had not known he possessed until he spoke it. An enchanted one, anyway. Something left that sword when it shattered, and I never got to say thank you, or say goodbye. I can't help feeling it might have understood me, if I had. I suppose it's a bit foolish. There was a short pause, and Kentucky shifted closer, wrapping her arms around his legs and pressing her cheek against his thigh. It would have. What about Bren's ring? Ember asked as carefully as he could manage, putting a gentle hand upon her head. Aren't you rather sad? I saw it, woven into her hair. Kentucky lifted her chin, but her usual sullen sadness when he mentioned that name had been replaced by a quiet resolution. Only another trinket she took. She can keep her Soromet spoils, and all the grief along with it. Why should I wish to be reminded of such bitterness all the long days of my life? He found he had no argument for that. I'm sorry to bring it up, then. Do not be sorry. I am mourning the man in secret for many winters, Ember. It is better to let his memory rest with my sister, now. They were silent until the sun had risen over their heads and some of the afternoon haze had retreated into the deep of the greenwoods, when Kentucky unexpectedly loosed her grasp on his hand and stepped forth, balancing at the edge of the water. She tipped her head to one side and set a few searching notes adrift across the vast lake, forlorn, like a lonely goose calling for its flock. The echoes sang back to them, and he thought the surface of the lake itself was disturbed by her song. The pattern of the wavelets shifted briefly before finding their usual path again. Ember. Do you trust me? The remark pinched his brows. Yes. But why? Do you trust me? Her mouth curved upward in a toothy smirk. He stammered for a moment, taken aback. If I didn't, he settled on at last, you would know. Then trust I shall return swiftly. And Kentucky waded into the dreadful shallows with hardly a sound, humming quietly to herself as she swayed with the ebb and flow of the lake, taking one patient step after another. Ember watched her closely, afflicted with some barely repressed instinctual premonition that a half-dead sirena would leap from the waters and drag her out of reach again. Trust, she repeated softly, the words carried back to him as if she could hear his quickened heartbeat. I shall not stray far. What are you searching for? He asked, baffled. HHM, she replied cheerfully and unhelpfully. It was not until Kentucky had submerged almost to her shoulders that she let out a sharp croaking cry and disappeared with a splish and a plop of rumpled water, only a ripple left in the place where she had vanished. Ember shouted after her, stumbling into the shallows. She re-emerged when he was still in ankle-deep water, drenched in dark dripping hair which parted around a wild grin, fangs glistening as she let out a triumphant laugh. It rang around the lake in playful echoes which bounced across the blackness and into the rustling forest. I am coming back to you now. Damn you, Kentucky. Ember panted, backing out of the muck and mud and hunching over to catch his breath, limbs trembling with nervous anticipation from the fight which never happened. He meant to rip into her for frightening him, but what came out instead was something rather different. My shoes are all wet, now. Just you wait, rogue. I swear I'll get you for that. Ooh, I hope you do, she interrupted with a pleased trill, and began making her way toward him with the swiftness she had promised. I hope you do much more than that. Why am I the one blushing? He thought furiously. His pounding heart now beat a different rhythm. When Kentucky emerged fully from the lake, the smile vanished and she wiped the hair from her eyes with one wrist, the other held behind her back. With a dignified sniff, she revealed her prize, the gleaming hilt of fish bitter. It rested securely in her dark-fingered grasp, the crossguard damp and shining brightly against the moonstruck pallor of her palm, and the shard which remained of the blade almost crystalline in its sharp imperfection. Kentucky held it out to him expectantly, the look on her face strangely uncertain, yet hopeful. Ember stared at her in silence, painting a portrait in his mind. Kentucky stared back, dripping with lake water, the speckled weeds slowly slipping across her oily hair as if it were the surface of an inky pond. She gasped as he dodged around her offering and clasped her tightly to his chest. For a moment she did not move, her arms still outstretched, And then he felt her careful hand upon the small of his back. Her face turned against his shoulder, and as his chin fell to rest on her hair, any lingering tension seeped out through the soles of his feet and soaked into the ground beneath him with the water from his shoes. They remained locked together until the rest of the afternoon haze had lifted from the lake and Ember's curiosity overpowered him. He withdrew, slipping his hand around hers and accepting the proffered gift. That crystalline reflection of the metal dazzled his eyes. No. Not a reflection. It was translucent, like cut glass. A warped view of the grass and pebbles beneath his feet wavered through clear metal as Ember turned it in his hand, remembering how the sword had appeared in his dream. He carefully appraised what remained of the fuller, the etching of an unseen F rune indenting his finger. I'm holding a ghost, he thought grimly. What happened to this blade? Kentucky observed the jagged edges with some emotion that was indecipherable to him, but bordered on distaste. Perhaps it perished of shame when it stabbed you. Ember cast her a reproachful look. You sense nothing magical about this? She touched a finger to the flat of a glassy surface. The magic has sundered itself. There are only echoes left, and it still sings of war and death. It has changed, somehow. As if it is no longer made of metal. It is more like stone. Though not so heavy as stone, within the echoes is a voice like stone voice. I know not what changed it, but I suppose everything changes in death. There was a pensive note to her words. I'm no longer convinced of that, Ember said softly. Maybe when the spell unraveled, or when I dreamt about it, I did dream of it, you know? Maybe it had some unpredictable effect on the original weaving. Or perhaps this was the intention all along, if ever the magic came undone, though I can't imagine why. He trailed off, lamenting that he had none of his ancestors' knowledge of magical things, except that which lay buried in the recesses of his memory along with 1,000 wailing voices. I wonder what sort of enchantments these were, he said instead. I wonder if they're gone forever, or if they could be reawakened somehow. Not that anyone alive today would know. He gently drew the blade across his finger, and a tiny sliver of blood bloomed forth. Whatever enchantment had been woven into the metal was well and truly dead. Ember! Kentucky shouted at him, grabbing his hand and pulling his finger into her mouth. She hummed irritably, a churring sound that shivered up from the deep of her ribs, and the stinging subsided with its vibrations. She stared up at him, her eyes accusing. Sorry, he mumbled contritely. I just wanted to know for sure. You know now. Her voice had an edge to it, and she did not release his hand, but ran her thumb across the pad of his finger, over and over. He thought it was self-soothing more than it was meant to soothe him. Ember allowed it, feeling a bit guilty, and twirled the hilt. It was soberingly light in his grasp, fractured edge glinting in the sun. I feel I owe this sword a debt, somehow. It wouldn't be right to abandon it here. You will not, she affirmed. We take it with us. Perhaps it can be remade by one who knows more than we do, if any yet live to remember such things. He fidgeted, thinking of the ancient voices and the rush of power which had fled his grasp not so very long ago. Speaking of magic, her attention snapped to him sharply. I heard the songs you speak of, I think. Or felt something like them. He glanced down, almost embarrassed by the recounting. After all, he had sensed an opportunity and failed to grasp it, hadn't he? It never came to anything, but I thought, that night. Maybe if I just knew the right words to say, I could have touched your song. Made it stronger. Or, let your song touch me, somehow. It made me wonder if men still have the same sort of power as the river folk, only different. Or, no, that's not quite right. Cold fingers grasped his arm, and Ember flinched. When he looked up, a pair of dark eyes sparkled back at him eagerly. You felt this, then? Was it the first time? No, not exactly. When the demon, that demon thing, Kentucky's left eye squinted slightly, but she did not interrupt him. It pulled me out of my body, and I wondered if it put me back wrong, when it let go? I could hear all those souls it was devouring, and they knew so many things. While we were together, I knew all the things they knew, too, but I'm finding it difficult to remember them. They keep, the words, rather, Or at least I think they're words. Maybe it's more of a feeling. They wriggle away from me somehow, and I can't hold on to them. Like a slippery fish, Kentucky murmured with a thoughtful hum. Ember laughed slightly despite his dismay. Yes, like that. Her grip tightened. I do not think you came back to yourself wrong, Ember. But I do know that something was unsettled within you. For that unpleasantness I am sorrowed. I love you, Kentucky. Her mouth twitched but not into a smile, and she licked her lips, glancing away strangely, as if the thought was still distressing to her in some way, or, perhaps, unfathomable. Ember fought back the rising desire to smother her doubt in his arms. It is well enough. I have all the time to show her the truth of it. But if it shook your soul in such a way and the magic of men has awakened to your song, and you long for it, then you ought to grasp it if ever you can, however you might, and with all the ambition you are knowing. He blinked, returning to the present moment, and then gaped at her as he comprehended her enthusiasm. Do you think so? She bounced on her toes, shaking his arm. Yes. I will help you. A breathy laugh escaped him. You will. Think what you might be accomplishing if you can one day weave magic as well as I can, she mused, huffing the words out quickly. I do not think the strength of men is in a song, but perhaps there is the place to begin. It is all I know of words and magic. Ember was not sure what he had expected from Kentucky. Perhaps disapproval or trepidation, but not this wild excitement. It was infectious, and bolstered his own curiosity. Your language would be difficult for me to grasp, he admitted, and mine has changed from what it was, once. No matter, she rebuked him blithely. If there is a way for you to become knowing of the things that I know, then I wish to help you. After all, you let me dream with you. She shrugged as if this was a perfectly fair trade. Oh, and because I shared my dreams with you once, you're bound to share all your siren secrets with me, eh? He prompted, poking her in the chest. Kentucky grinned, poking him back. Not all of them. Most, then. Her claw tapped her chin. A few. All of them, or I seek my revenge for the fright you gave me just now, he declared, narrowing his eyes at her and acutely aware that the smile threatening the corners of his mouth severely eroded his composure. Before she could respond, a distant clarion cry from above echoed 1,000 times off the face of the mountain, and Ember turned to see a flock of dark-winged geese sweeping across the vast blue fathoms of the sky. They wove deftly in and out of the welkin currents, necks outstretched toward the coast to the west, speaking earnestly amongst each other of the journey ahead. As they dipped below the peaks of the Sisters, which yet held the faintest hint of summer snow, Kentucky hummed in rhythm with their song, a song which had brought Ember to the stoop of his cabin more than once, hands braced between the door frames as he leaned out to catch a wistful glimpse of the passing flock through a break in the branches above, and hearken to their call. A few secrets, and I shall sing for you many, many tales about the beautiful ocean you wish to know. The air was rich and resonant beneath her promise, and he shivered from the plucked weight of it, holding his breath as he recalled a blue-green wisp upon a distant mountainside, its fractal colors drifting like the languid river shallows he once called home. At last, he said, I have a proposition for you, Kentucky. Kentucky smiled as if she knew the words before he spoke them, her wide eyes alight, anticipation dancing in their depths. Let us wander there, you and I, to see it for ourselves. Chapter 66. A Strange Refrain. A breeze creaked through the branches of the lowland forest, shuffling a couplet of last autumn's leaves and papery bark. Ember drew slow breaths of the crisp morning freshness, drinking deep of pine pitch and loamy musk. The battered arming sword he had haggled for wages garnered by an odd task here and there rested comfortably on his hip, and a brown cloak trailed along the forest floor, tattered and dulled from a winter of wear but lovingly fastened over a moss-green circuit. He knelt beside a stream not far from where they had made camp. It tumbled down the wooded hillside, and after quenching his own thirst, he set about replenishing their flask. It had been brimming for some time now, but he cherished the chill of the water as it rippled past his fingers, murmuring cheerful tidings of spring and the coming warmth. He had become more attuned to the music of things, after spending so long in the presence of one who knew 1,000 melodies, or perhaps it was the thread between their souls which supplemented his senses. With Kentucky's eager tales of her own spellweaving and many long hours of sitting and listening or, more often, softly singing together, searching for the essence of something he did not yet understand, Ember even fancied he could hear what she heard, now and then, the soft fey rhythm of raindrops pattering on boughs above, the discordant premonition of thunder not yet sounded, the faintest melody of an old branch creaking in the wind. It was in one of these reveries which he now found himself when a sharp whistle pierced the rustling stillness of the forest. Ember sprang up, snatching the sword from his belt and running silently uphill on leather-clad feet, pausing every few steps to crouch and observe his surroundings, reaching out with his mind and letting the pull beckon him from afar. The invisible knowing connected them always, tugging him gently in the direction of Kentucky, if he thought about it, wanted it, hard enough. Thus it was not long before he caught sight of her green cloak, tucked away amongst the scraggly forest undergrowth and caught lightly across the mossy stone she crouched behind. Kentucky glanced over her shoulder, eyes hidden in the darkness of her hood, and pressed a finger to her lips as he crept alongside her. She pointed to a hunched figure trudging away down the wagon-rutted path. Even from this distance, it appeared to be a broad-shouldered man with a walking stick and an old pack strapped to his back. Ember squinted, one hand on Kentucky's arm. A curved sword adorned the man's belt, and as the stranger moved closer he recognized the wide-brimmed hat sitting low over his eyes. Hunter. Kentucky startled and tugged her hood further forward as he grasped her hand, pulling her to her feet. The man turned round, thumping his hat down on his head as a sudden gust of wind threatened to blow it into the trees. "Boy!" he shouted affably, leaning on his walking stick. Ember scampered lightly onto the path with Kentucky close behind. He thought for a moment whether it would be wiser to tell her to keep hidden, or at the very least keep silent, but it was only Hunter, after all. Even a winter of travel and misadventures had not sufficed to tarnish his boyhood enchantment of the wayfarer. Hunter had still been everywhere, and seen everything there was to see, as far as Ember was concerned. "Hello!" he cried excitedly, when he was near enough to be properly heard without the woodland echoes. "What are you doing this far west of the mountains?" Hunter shook the walking stick at him before resuming his original posture, and Ember realized that it was a different walking stick than he had carried with him last. "Always so quick with the questions. Finally left your little valley, did ya? I wondered how long it would take." It had been no more than a full turning of the seasons since he had glimpsed the rugged wayfarer setting off for unknown lands, but as Ember approached he noted a marked change in appearance. The sword was no longer stuffed in his pack, for one thing, but hung present and ready at his hip, a notched and wicked-looking blade unlike any he had seen in the valley or the towns he had passed through. His cloak was more tattered than Ember's, his eyes more haggard still, and there was a quickness about his movements and an alertness to his manner where before he had never much cared. "Found a friend, have you?" Kentucky stepped behind him and he heard a shuffling of cloth as she fastened the gloves he had procured for her in Ridgeville. Hunter's dark eyes flashed. "I am Kentucky," she said simply, muffling the musicality of her voice. "You are the hunter?" They had decided it would be all right to continue using the first part of her siren name, and adopt the traditional moniker of Ember Sworn. Nobody would know what the simple sound meant, and it would save them the headache of accidentally using the wrong name around the wrong individual. Likewise, Ember had relinquished the surname of Jarlson, for he had become his own man. He was, now and forever, Ember Sworn. "The hunter," Hunter repeated, some amusement prickling the words. "Ha! The hunter, eh? I'd answer to that. And you are? Ah, oh, Ember blushed furiously as he wondered how to articulate their relationship. Then he wondered if he would always blush this way. "This is my wife." The scent of flowers suffused him as she reached around Ember to grasp his elbow in tight fingers, and he fought away a twitching smile at her sudden shyness. He had spoken so much of Hunter and his tall tales that it must be akin to meeting a man from a myth. In his own way, Ember reflected, he was a man of many myths, wandering through distant lands, gathering songs as he went, and never staying in any one place for long. Perhaps he was a bit of a myth come to life everywhere he went, to the folk who knew him well and strangers alike. That is, if anyone could claim to know Hunter well. Hunter fixed his gaze upon the cloaked figure which clung to Ember's arm. "Be that true?" "Yes," she said primly, lifting her chin. "He is my Ember now." Hunter swooped down with shocking agility and snatched a field marigold where it grew beside the thoroughfare, one of the few that hadn't been lost to the frost and chill of an early spring. He twirled it between his thumb and forefinger, beard twitching. "Ain't that something, then?" he said glibly, staring at Kentucky. "Any soul might be seeing who's the lucky one of the pair." Kentucky did not refute his words aloud, but stepped to Ember's side and slowly slipped her fingers through his, lifting her chin and looking quietly at Hunter. His beard twitched again and he held the flower up to his eyes, squinting at the sunny petals. Well, and that was all. He expected the stout wayfarer to bark a laugh. Instead, he stepped closer and bowed very low. Ember had never seen him lower himself before anyone in all his life. "Lady Kentucky Embersworn," he murmured, as if he had been presented with a noblewoman from the noblest house in all the lands he had ever wandered. "Hunter Manson as pleased as ever to make your acquaintance. The honor is mine. And you could not find a better nor more stubborn fool than he." "I've told her much about your adventures," confessed Ember, an awkwardness reddening his cheeks again, "and to be entirely truthful, she has been hoping to meet with you ever since the day I first spoke your name." Kentucky dug her concealed claws into the crook of his arm. "It is a true thing, long have I wished to meet with you." Hunter's chest puffed out slightly, and Ember quickly stifled a laugh behind his hand. "That so?" She stepped closer to him with an earnest hum, a curious tilt of her head, her river-wet feet soaking through the soft boots and strips of cloth bound around them, and the hem of her cloak still dripping. This time it was Ember who caught hold of her elbow, suddenly concerned. Hunter's keen eyes flashed over her figure again. Ember protectively wrapped an arm about her shoulders. They had left Ridgeful in something of a hurry, fleeing before the rumors of an unfortunate encounter wherein she had been compelled to wield her voice could spread, and it would have been far more disastrous if Kentucky had not calmed their fears with her words. He could not bear to lose Hunter's friendship in like fashion. That would be entirely worse, somehow, than being run out of Sisters Valley altogether. "Have you any companion?" Kentucky asked him readily with childlike innocence, sweeping a tress of hair out from the cloak and letting it spill across her shoulders. Ember widened his eyes at her, but Hunter released that barking laugh he had been expecting and settled back on his heels. "I am a man of many companions, though none who walk beside me." The creases around his weathered eyes looked strained, and Ember noticed that the smile did not reach his gaze. "I'm sorry," he apologized on behalf of Kentucky's forwardness. Hunter shrugged, grinding his working stick into the road. "Not all tales have blessed tidings, young sir." "You are young," said Kentucky gently, "and the seas are vast. You will find your blessing yet." "Ha!" grunted Hunter, obviously amused, but he tipped the brim of his hat to her, and Ember, who knew him well enough to tell, thought he glimpsed the beginnings of a smirk under his graying beard. "Perhaps I will, at that. And now, I'm off to see your superstitious friends in the valley, Ember. Shall I carry them news of our meeting?" "I'd rather ye didn't," muttered Ember. "Sure, now?" There was a canny interest in the words which made Ember reluctant to reply. "It's a long story. They are no friends of mine." Hunter raised a brow, twirling the flower between his fingertips. "That so?" A sliver of a grin broke through his craggy face, though it made him appear somehow more dangerous than before. "Now, that's a tale I'd like to hear. But another time, I'm afraid. I'd like to make Ridgeful before dark. It's been a long day." In a moment, he had caught up Kentucky's hand in both of his, tucking the flower into her gloved fingers, and, before Ember could say or do anything or indeed think of anything to do or say, planted a kiss on her knuckles. When he pulled away, a wrinkle between his brows had deepened, and the set of his mouth was grim. "What brings you back to the valley?" Ember asked quickly, fumbling for distraction. The grimness was banished with a cheeky grin. "Oh, this and that, this and that." And Hunter winked at Kentucky. It slowly dawned on Ember, Isabel. If she'll have me. Truly. Hunter scratched at the back of his head. Have me for tea, leastways. Ember laughed outright, amused by the notion of the haggard wayfarer knocking on Isabel's door with a bunch of scraggly wildflowers hidden behind his back, and like as not she'd answer it in her apron, with her hair flying away from her braids and that perceptive glint in her eye that had sent many a would-be suitor hurrying on his way. Has she any idea of your intentions? He whistled a few bars of a strange refrain instead of answering. Kentucky looked up, suddenly. Their eyes met, hers in the dark of the cloak, and Hunter's dark in the daylight. Beware of whistling after sunfall, he advised, with an edge that made Ember rest a careful palm on the hilt of his battered sword, and keep a watch at night. Any particular reason you chose to impart these words of wisdom? Ember inquired softly. None whatsoever. His tone had shifted back to his usual brash cordiality, and now he shrugged as if it mattered not a whit. Farewell, madam. And he struck up the road at a brisk pace, back the way they had come. Keep an eye on that one, Ember, my boy. Before Ember could think over much about the words, Hunter set up a merry whistling tune, and then began to sing. Ember could just make out the words as he walked away. Oh, dream of cliffs above the bay on white sands shining bright, think not that I be coarse nor cold to flee by morning's light. T will be my footprints there up on that sandy shore, wonderin' where's I vanished to, wonder evermore. Ember stared after his receding silhouette as he walked into the light of the rising sun, spellbound by the hoarse voice and soft, inhuman melody, a meeting of two worlds in his mind. Wait! Kentucky cried suddenly, a note of power in her words. Hunter looked back at the two of them, one hand resting loosely on the sword hilt. Where are you hearing of this song? A long spell of silence followed her entreaty, and Ember held his breath. At last, Hunter doffed his hat again, and smiled. Away upon the salty seas, long, long ago. And he whacked a bush with his walking stick and carried on his way. I like your Hunter, said Kentucky after a short while, as he disappeared over a rise in the path. He is kind and wise. And a salty old rogue, but you're perhaps the first besides myself to see his finer qualities. It's a shame the townsfolk sent him away so often, grumbled Ember. Maybe a quiet life isn't for him, but I sometimes wonder if he longs for hearth and home when the weather turns foul. When we are having a nest of our own, you must tell him he is welcome there. Eh? You mind the company? Not in the least, he laughed. I'm only surprised that you took such a liking to him. They strolled in mutual silence for several minutes, enjoying each other's company and pondering the departure of the strange wayfarer. He hesitated, mulling over his next words. A nest of our own. Yes, she murmured. Someday. Kentucky. He stopped working, and turned to look at her suddenly. Are you happy? Kentucky stared up at him for several moments, the only sounds the rushing of the stream nearby and the wind catching the hem of her plain dress. Her eyes were big and thoughtful, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, making him blush again. He wanted to ask her if she truly longed for a place all their own. If, sometimes, she secretly wished for pretty dresses and shiny things, or the ocean depths where he could never follow. For a life where he was not bound to the secrecy of her affections, and she was not shrouded by silence for the sake of his kin, and they dared to linger long wherever they pleased, unafraid of being run off in the night watches. Before he could speak another word, she pressed her smile to his. He found that he had nothing else to say after all. The End Epilogue. Ember scraped a sharp stone across the branch, another piece of wood curling away beneath his hands. It fell to the mossy dirt amid a pile of shavings, smelling of newly cut timber and pleasant memories. He didn't need to use the chipped stone, having acquired a knife and various other implements along his travels, but it was a sacred experience which held memories of the first wooden weapon he had carved many summers past. Pitch clung to his roughened fingers, but it didn't bother him. He enjoyed working with his hands. A tendril of smoke wafted up toward the roof of tangled boughs overhead, remnants from their fire of the night before. It had almost burnt out, and only a few smoldering coals remained. He would kick dirt over it before they left. He flexed his wrist, admiring the sturdy branch. It would make a fine spear when he was through, and already the end was quite sharp. He would be grateful to be armed with a familiar weapon again, especially in these strange lands. Strange, and stranger still. Each footstep carried him farther away from Sister's Mountain, until not even Kentucky knew what lay between them and the nearest town. Ember took a deep breath and closed his eyes, resting the sharpened stick against a bent knee. The air was cooler here, and sweet, the way it often smelled after a rainfall, but there was another scent which mingled with the trees and loamy earth, something fresh and clean. "The ocean," Kentucky said. "When you smell it, you will remember it always, and ever it will be beckoning you to return to those shores." He glanced across the smoldering coals and circle of stones, where she lay curled into herself, her chin resting on her hands. He no longer blushed after her from afar, resigned to fleeting touches, but quiet moments like these reminded him of those days of eternal night. Her lashes twitched in visions he knew not, a sight which usually compelled him to brush his fingers over her dreaming eyes when they lay tangled together beneath the moon. Their closeness still seemed a foolish fancy at times. When a faint light twinkled through the branches above him, he glanced up, expecting to see the last of a glimmering star. Instead, a luminous orb drifted overhead. It bobbed among the branches like an errant dandelion puff blown on the wind, though the forest was calm. As if attracted to the warmth, the bubble of bluish-green light floated toward the fire, leisurely drifting down through the boughs. Then it lofted above Kentucky's chosen nest. Ember tensed, his hand tightening on the spear, but the little wisp only brushed across her face. She sighed as the glow washed over her shimmering cheek, but did not wake. It wandered across the clearing in his direction. Ember loosened his grasp on the spear and watched it silently, relaxed but cautious. It flickered, and he reached out, drawn by some innate curiosity. A thrum of energy rippled through his fingertips as his hand passed through the orb, and he took a breath, blinking quietly. The wisp bobbed gently before his face several times, and he found himself wondering if it was the same orb which had come to hear Kentucky speak and warned him away from the mountain path, what seemed so long ago. Then it drifted up and away through the sparkling branches of the trees and out of sight, fading into the early glow of dawn. A few birds twittered in the branches, beginning their morning carolly, and the world was touched with gold and silver dew.